morning and a very warm welcome to the Point. I'm Birgit, and as always it is such a blessing to be with you for the program. Well, the topic on the program tonight is based around a verse in Acts. It's Acts 17:28, which is that in him we live and move and have our being. This will take the form of a special presentation by our friend and my co-host, Dr. Richard Kent. Richard, welcome to the Point.
Well, it's lovely to be here with you. Thanks very much.
Well, I'm so excited to hear what you have to say about this particular verse in Acts. So can I start off by asking, this verse, in him we live and move and have our being, what does this verse mean to you?
Well, I'll tell you what it means to me is that from second to second to second, literally, from second to second to second, our life is totally dependent on God. And people don't, most of us, including me, don't realise this, but from second to second, our very existence, the fact we're actually alive, is totally dependent on God. And it just, as we talk about this, we can actually increase our understanding of the amazing intelligence, power, and design ability of God, the Creator.
I think that's a wonderful way to begin the program. It actually reminds me of a devotional I read by David Wilkerson once, and he said similarly, it's this concept that we begin to develop, that every facet of our existence is in God, is held by God, willed by God, our very being, our lives, our movement, all within him and sustained by him and purposed by him. It is a truly awesome thought. So thank you for sharing that.
That's all right. Well, what I'm going to share is obviously there's technical aspects, because that's what I tend to do, on the very fact from moment to moment, from second to second, we exist because of what God provides for us in order to live. But of course, we can, towards the end of the program, Birgit's possibly will expand a bit about the greatness of God, the power of God, and how he has created the whole universe, and how he's chosen us before the foundation of the earth, and how we are fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm not putting words into Birgit's mouth, but there's so much we could talk about on this topic. But I'm just going to talk about the technical aspects of how we're literally in him we live and move and have our being from second to second to second. So shall I go straight ahead?
Absolutely.
Okay, well look, I'm sitting and talking to a camera actually, but you lovely people, the lovely viewers of Revelation TV, are watching this, and as you're watching it, you're processing information from your ears and your eyes, and you're using your central processing system, which you tend to call our brain, to process all this information. So let's have a look at a picture of our brain. Well, our brain is seriously complex, unbelievably complex. It's far more complex than at least 1 million NASA supercomputers. It's a living, amazing organ, and the information travels through the brain at the speed of 250 miles an hour. In fact, you could light a light bulb, a 12-volt light bulb, from all the electrical activity going on in your brain and mine right now. But the point is that my brain and most of the other organs in my body are totally dependent on certain factors, and in particular sugar and oxygen. If you were to deprive my heart or my brain of sugar and oxygen for 3 seconds, I would be unconscious, and in 3 minutes I'll be dead. That's how we are totally dependent on God providing for us just 2 of the many, many other things. We need actually a huge number of what are called parameters, like temperature, the pH of our body, the humidity, the gravitational fields, the magnetic field, all sorts of other things. But I'm just going to concentrate just on 2, sugar and oxygen, to show how God provides us. Literally from second to second to second, we depend on God to provide these things for us, because we can't do it ourselves. We simply cannot provide our own glucose and oxygen for our brains and our hearts in order to live for another 3 seconds. We can't do it. Only God can do that, and that's why we're fearfully and wonderfully made. So let's have a look at the next picture. You see, in the scripture, it says in John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him he was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life. Emphasis, in him was life. All life comes from Jesus Christ, described in the New Testament as the Word. All life comes from Jesus Christ. Without Jesus Christ, there is no life. We could talk about that at length, but on this particular program, we're going to talk about the actual physical aspects of how God actually sustains us from second to second. But just throughout all of this, remember that Jesus Christ is actually the source of life. So let's have a look at the next picture. Now, the energy in our solar system comes from the sun. And the sun is a totally supernatural nuclear factory, actually. It's 93 million miles away, and it does, within the sun, something absolutely extraordinary happens which we cannot do. It's called nuclear fusion. Every second, 700,000 tons of hydrogen are converted into helium, except for 4 tons. And those 4 tons are released as heat, light, and energy. And the heat and the light and the energy provides all the energy for all of us to live. Now, if we could just go back to that, there we go, there actually is the next picture, which is 4 molecules of hydrogen combined in nuclear fusion to form 1 molecule of helium. And that's nuclear fusion. Now, we can do nuclear fission. You've probably heard of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was nuclear fission. And you've heard of nuclear reactors in power factories, and that's nuclear fission. It's very dirty, grubby business. We get nuclear waste, and we have to put nuclear waste in big yellow drums, sealed with concrete, and dump them in the sea. That's a million miles away, literally, from nuclear fusion, which God does in the sun. The core temperature of the sun is 15,000 degrees centigrade, and the pressure in the center of the sun, where the nuclear fusion happens, is 350 times the pressure at sea level on planet Earth. So that's one good reason why we can't do it, because we can't replicate either the temperature or the pressure. It's a supernatural event called nuclear fusion. Now, the sun produces light and heat. Now let's look at the next picture, which is the electromagnetic spectrum. Basically, you're familiar with the 7 colors of the rainbow, and there you have the 7 colors of the rainbow, the visible light, which comes to us as light. We don't see the 7 colors of the rainbow because they're all mixed together as visible light, except for rainbows, which are also supernatural, but we're not talking about rainbows right now. But in amongst that, that spectrum, at each end are dangerous rays. They are infrared and gamma rays and X-rays. Now, those are dangerous because I and you, we all have 100 trillion cells, give or take a few trillion, and all of those cells have DNA in them, all of them. And DNA can very easily be damaged by radiation, particularly from X-rays and gamma rays. So God has provided for us something absolutely fantastic up in the stratosphere called the ozone layer. Let's have a look at a picture of the ozone layer. And got the ozone layer, which you may have heard about, is actually incredibly efficient at filtering out all the dangerous gamma rays and X-rays, which would damage our DNA, and we would all have cancer. So that's how we have this, the sun, 93 million miles away, doing this supernatural nuclear fusion and churning out massive and massive energy. It's so bright we can't even look at it without burning our retinas. But God knows that we need the visible light and the infrared to warm our planet, but filters out the dangerous gamma rays and X-rays, which otherwise would damage our DNA in 100 trillion cells and give us cancer. Now, we need sugar and oxygen, and primarily that comes from the algae in the sea and all of the vegetation in the plants. So let's have a look at the next picture, which is simply a picture of plants. Now, the reason why plants are green is because of a chlorophyll in them, which is another supernatural molecule created by God. Actually, the chlorophyll absorbs all light except for certain wavelengths of blue and yellow. You may remember from nursery school that when you mix together blue and yellow paint, you get green. Well, actually, there are only two types of light that plants, all vegetation and algae, don't absorb, and it's some blue and some yellow, so they appear to be green. They're not actually green, they're brown. You know that in the autumn because they look brown, don't they? But actually, what's really happening is in those plants, those plants, using a totally supernatural equation called photosynthesis, are producing for us oxygen and sugar. Let's have a look at the next picture, because that shows us that all plants, all living organisms have DNA. We're very familiar with that mammals and fish and plants and mammals and fish and birds and humans have DNA, but plants have DNA as well. And actually, plant DNA is every bit as complex as human DNA, if not more complicated. And within the plants, this extraordinary thing happens called photosynthesis with 100% efficiency. If we look at the next picture now, in the presence of sunlight, water and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is basically a toxic product which we produce as we breathe out, is combined in the chlorophyll, in the chloroplast actually, to make oxygen and sugar, the very things we need. So, plants can't live without human beings and other living things giving off carbon dioxide because they need carbon dioxide to live. And we can't live without plants. If there weren't plants and algae, there wouldn't be enough oxygen for us. So here we have a symbiotic relationship between all living organisms and plants. And we can't live one without the other. It's another case of irreducible complexity. Planet Earth would not work if we didn't have living organisms, including humans, and plants, which breathe in carbon dioxide, which is a toxic waste product of humans and all living organisms. The plants breathe in the carbon dioxide and then convert it into oxygen and sugar for us. And that is the magnificence and power of God, that this symbiotic relationship is actually irreducibly complex. You couldn't evolve one without the other. You must have both. You must have living organisms and plants, because one won't work without the other, and that's how God intended it to be. Let's see what the next picture is. It's a human lung. So we're talking now about the oxygen. Now, we all have two lungs, and each lung has a surface area about the size of a tennis court. But I want to show you something truly remarkable, is that the alveoli, the tiny little sacs in your lungs, would collapse. If it wasn't for God's fairy liquid, it's not called God's fairy liquid, it's called a surfactant. It's basically a detergent which reduces the surface tension of the alveoli so they do not collapse. And there you can see, on the right-hand side, you could see the little bubbles. They're called like little chambers full of air. And they're so very tiny that the capillaries containing the hemoglobin go past them with all the little red blood cells going in single file past them and delivering waste carbon dioxide and picking up oxygen. And that's the amazing, miraculous God we serve. Literally from second to second to second, we live and move in Him. And then if we look at the next picture, the hemoglobin picks up, the red blood cells pick up the oxygen from the lungs, and then give off the oxygen into the brain and the heart and the lungs and all the other tissues. And I want to tell you something extraordinary about hemoglobin. It's got iron in it. You've probably heard of iron deficiency anemia. Iron is very important, but I'll tell you something about iron. It's also toxic. If we have too much iron, as they did in the last century, the Victorians often used to die of iron toxicity because they used to cook with metal metal pans and had iron pipework, and too much iron will kill us. But God has got it just right, so we have enough iron on board to make the central part of the hemoglobin molecule without being toxic. And now that is another illustration of how powerful God is. We live and move and have our being in God. So I want to move on to the next picture, which is our circulatory system, 60,000 miles of blood vessels. All the heart pumps all this blood around, our 10 pints of blood, to containing the oxygen and containing the oxygen and containing also all the food, and in particular the glucose, because remember our brains in particular cannot survive for more than 3 seconds without oxygen or glucose. If you were to cut off my oxygen or my glucose from my brain, after 3 seconds I would be unconscious on the floor, and after 3 minutes I'd be dead. It's the same with my heart, actually. If you were to cut off the blood from my heart, if I had a coronary artery disease and had a heart attack, if that coronary artery disease was advanced and I had a heart attack, and that wasn't killed off enough of my heart tissue, I would be dead in 3 minutes. It's simple as that. In Him we live and move and have our being. Let's now look at how the sugar is taken on board. We eat all our food through our mouths, and it goes into our stomach, which is very acidic. It has a pH of 1, which is the same as car battery acid. It is absolutely extraordinary that we're carrying this very, very acidic content in our stomach, and yet it doesn't burn a hole in our stomach, because God also provides an alkaline over the villi, the lining of our stomachs. But God puts the acid in our tummy for a very good reason, because if we were to swallow a fly, it does happen to some of us occasionally, if people who do a lot of exercise, whether it's walking, running, or anything else. If you're out of doors, occasionally you'll swallow a mosquito or a fly or something. Well, they're covered in bacteria, but it doesn't matter. Very rarely does anybody get ill after swallowing a fly, because the acid in the stomach immediately sterilizes them, which is God's intention. Anyway, if we come back to that same picture, if possible, there we are. The food in our stomach is then transported into the duodenum and the small intestine and broken down into the various components. But what I wanted to tell you is that underneath the stomach is a very important organ called the pancreas. And within the pancreas are special target organs called the islets of Langerhans, which produce insulin. Now, insulin is absolutely vital in our bodies, because our blood sugar has to be controlled within a very, very narrow range. If my blood sugar goes too high, I'll have hyperglycemia, which is very dangerous. If my blood sugar goes too low, I'll have hypoglycemia, and I'll fall off the chair. High blood sugar is diabetes, low blood sugar is hypoglycemia, and both are very dangerous and both potentially fatal. So that's how we live and move and have our being, because God regulates from second to second the blood sugar. We eat maybe every 4 or 5 hours, whatever it is you do. It doesn't actually matter how often you eat. Some people only eat once a day. But that doesn't matter, because God can control our blood sugar over a 24-hour period by a very, very active process involving breakdown of glycogen into sugar, using adrenaline and noradrenaline and various other catecholamines, but also causing the sugar to go into the cells using insulin. It's highly complex, so I'll talk about it in another program, but it's another example of irreducible complexity. We live and move and have our being because God controls our blood sugar from second to second to second. There on the next picture is a picture of the pancreas. I've said enough about that. And there, the last picture is the mitochondria in the human cells, and that's where all the energy is created. We need the energy in our bodies to actually move around. All those mitochondria in our cells, they're using from second to second to second, they're using the glucose and the oxygen in our cells to create energy. Enough of that. Birgit, what do you think?
Oh, Richard, I think it's absolutely amazing, and thank you so much for sharing about your knowledge and research in these areas. It's so diverse, the themes that you've covered, and the way that you see the life of God and the sustenance of God reflected in our physiology and also in the created world around us. So thank you so much for all you shared, and how this actually really illustrates for you the verse in Acts 17, in Him we live and move and have our being. And in the remaining minutes, I think you mentioned at the beginning, just to offer a slight biblical reflection on this particular verse, because it is actually a really interesting story with the Apostle Paul being in the city of Athens, and he's walking around the city, and Acts 17 describes how his spirit is provoked within him because he sees all of the idols being worshipped. So he starts engaging with the Jews in the synagogue and the Gentiles in the marketplace, and gets into all kinds of philosophical discussions with the Epicureans and the Stoics, and eventually finds himself in the Areopagus, where he defends what he's sharing about the resurrection of Christ. And the Athenians who were there were supernaturalists. They believed in supernatural powers intervening with natural laws. So at least they did have this idea that there was a deity, something beyond our human understanding, that had involvement in human affairs. But I think you mentioned it at the start of the program, because Paul was a master evangelist. What he did is he took what was familiar and known to the group with whom he was speaking, and then used that to point to Yahweh, to Jesus, to the Creator God. And he did that in this instance because he saw this altar to an unknown God. And actually, I have the verse here where he actually he uses that, and he says, I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, and I also found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you: the God who made the world and all things in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things, which you've shared about. And he made from one man every nation. And then it goes on, it says that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. Now, what's interesting with that is that that particular verse, he must have been he was a very educated man, because he was actually tapping into another cultural aspect of those with whom he was speaking. He's actually quoting a poem by a Cretan poet called Epimenides. The poem is actually called Critica, and Epimenides, he was actually writing about this mythological god Zeus when he wrote this. The actual verse says, and he was speaking to the Cretans, he says, "They fashioned a tomb for you, holy and high one. Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, but you are not dead, you live and abide forever, for in you we live and move and have our being." So Epimenides was actually writing about Zeus, and he was calling his fellow Cretans liars because they believed in the mortality of Zeus, but Epimenides believed that Zeus was immortal. But Paul, the apostle, took that poem that his audience would have been familiar with, and again, very cleverly used that to point to Yahweh, the Creator God. So it's a really interesting illustration of Paul's method in evangelism. And I was fascinated to actually learn the background to that particular verse, which we, of course, now understand in light of our Lord Jesus Christ. So just a few thoughts which shed some light on this particular passage from the Bible.
Well, I think that's absolutely fascinating. Actually, I didn't know that. That's terribly interesting. So obviously that would have meant a great deal to them, the listeners, when Paul quoted that particular verse, saying that the unknown God you don't know really is Yahweh.
That's exactly right. It's interesting because Paul also refers to Epimenides in another epistle in the New Testament when he writes to Titus. In the first chapter of Titus, he also alludes to this particular verse that I read from this poem Critica. So Paul does refer to this prophet and poet in different instances. So we have 30 seconds left on the program. Richard, I wonder if there are any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave with us.
Well, just don't forget, in all life comes from Jesus Christ, and in him we live and move and have our being from second to second to second, and actually, eventually, in eternity too, forever and forever. Thank you.
Richard, that is such a wonderful way to end the program. It has been so interesting learning about Acts 17:28 and how you understand this in light of our physiology and the created world around us. Thank you so much. We hope the program has been a blessing to you. We look forward to seeing you this time next week. And in the meantime, may God bless you.